Hi, everyone. I'd like to talk to you about a project that is nearly completed, but still a little bit underway with the organizers of this meeting, including Brian Nosek, John Krosnick, and Leif Nelson, and Jan Walacek, and then many other individuals listed up here who were also involved in running this project. So, as has been now said numerous times, it is increasingly appreciated that many findings in science fail to replicate. This point was really hit home more than a decade ago by John Ioannidis, who's one of really the fathers of meta-research and meta-science, making a very powerful argument that when you look carefully at studies, they oftentimes don't replicate. And this was, although not entirely ignored, rather ignored by the scientific community until more recently, where there's now been an increasing appreciation of the difficulties of replicating studies. The challenges in replicating studies has been especially carefully investigated in psychology, and I'd like to emphasize here that this is not simply because psychology is especially difficult to replicate, but because as psychologists, we are especially interested in the various different factors that could contribute of scientific behavior that could contribute to it. And psychology has really been on the forefront of identifying some of the sources of challenges to reproducibility. There have been a number of reproducibility studies in psychology, many of them led by Brian Nosek. This is a listing of some of the major ones. And as you can see, overall, the replication rate is 47%. We can debate about exactly what that means. There certainly has been debate in the literature, but it's clear that this is an issue worthy of investigation. So one of the goals of this project was to try to understand in more detail the replicability of psychological studies. A second goal was an interesting aspect that has not been brought up as much today, and that is that even when studies do replicate, oftentimes the replicated studies have a smaller effect size than the original. And this is a finding that has been known as the decline effect, and also known as the discoverer's curse, and is also an observation that was pointed out early on in the field by Ioannidis. So this decline effect has been observed in a number of different domains in a meta analysis. Jenyns and Mueller basically reviewed meta-analyses in various different domains of ecology and found that there was a small but significant decline in effect size with the year of publication, and the effective year of publication remained even after we were controlled for sampling efforts. So I'm looking over an entire field, finding that the effect sizes were larger in the initial studies and then became smaller. Another example, this is a decline effect in drug treatment of schizophrenia. And as you can see, there is this gradual decline in the difference between the active agent and a placebo effect. It's also interesting in this case that it's not just the first study that's big and then all the others small, but this sort of gradual decline. There's a paper that is coming out soon by David Yeager, John Krosnick, and colleagues. They tested 7 highly cited social psychological phenomena and used a randomly sampled representative group of American adults, and they found, encouragingly, that they were able to replicate 6 of the 7 findings. But interestingly, when they compared the original finding to the to other metrics, they found that it was larger. So the original finding was larger than a meta-analytic effect sizes documented by other studies that looked at that same phenomena. It was substantially smaller than the see if I can get this pointer to work. Yeah, so it's smaller than the meta-analysis. It's substantially smaller than their representative sample. And even when they looked at their representative sample, just looking at college students, it was still smaller. So the original effect size was markedly larger than subsequent findings. So there have been a number of different accounts of this so-called decline effect. Perhaps the most sort of compelling, straightforward one is regression to the mean. So if a finding is randomly inflated in the initial, or is inflated for some reason in the initial publication, then its replication will likely be associated with a smaller effect size. And if you think about it, if, and this is likely the case, initial studies are underpowered, then the only way that they're going to get a significant effect is if they get lucky and have some additional error variance working for them. And so that additional error variance working for them will not be seen in subsequent studies. There'll be a regression to the mean, and the subsequent studies will have a smaller effect. Another possibility is publication bias. Journals may be unwilling to publish very sort of just barely significant results for initial studies, and they may be more tolerant of that for follow-up studies. Another possibility is selective reporting. The initial authors of studies are especially motivated to make their effects seem significant and robust, and they may be engaging in more egregious p-hacking or other kinds of selective reporting. Another possibility is changes in protocol. It's possible that when individuals do replications, they don't have all of the exact details the same as the original study, and that could lead to reduced effects. It may even be that the individuals who ran the initial study were unaware of certain key elements, perhaps some characteristics of what the experimenter was doing that they didn't even realize were important, that may have played an important role. And there also may be changes in recent developments. For example, populations may change. People may learn about a drug, and that may have an effect. Placebos may be increasing because people believe in the power of the effect. So all of these different kinds of conventional accounts could contribute to decline effects. It's also possible, although less likely, that there could be some unconventional account of decline effects. And I sort of sheepishly have to admit that I have considered that in a commentary piece in Nature. I observed less likely, but not inconceivable, is an effect stemming from some unconventional process, perhaps just as the act of observation has been suggested to affect quantum measurement. Scientific observation could subtly change some scientific effects. This, of course, is would be sort of an explanation of last resort, but since we don't fully understand the effects of observation, it seems at least plausible. Well, at least it seems so to me. So the goals of this present study were first and foremost to develop a gold standard of a replication protocol, where we made every effort to design experiments and implement replications in a manner that simultaneously maintained ecological validity, so each lab was working independently in various different ways, while maximizing the likelihood of full replicability. And this would then provide an index for how well psychological findings can replicate. And as I'll be emphasizing again, what we're doing here is not attempting to replicate pre-existing findings, but to discover new findings and see how well each lab could replicate those. And then the second goal was to test whether the replication of newly devised experimental protocols are associated with declining effect sizes, and to see whether or not that occurred even when all reasonable efforts were made to minimize such decline. So if we do everything right, if we basically eliminate as best as we can all the possible sources of decline effects that I listed before, do they go away? Okay, So the basic approach of the current study was as follows. We had 4 labs, my lab at UCSB, Brian Nosik's lab at the Center for Open Science in UVA, John Krosick's lab at Stanford, and Leif Nelson's lab at Berkeley. And each attempted to discover 4 new psychological effects using a representative sample of the US population. So we essentially were setting out to discover new things, and one of the things we discovered is it's hard to discover new things. And then once a lab believed that they had discovered an effect, they locked it in with a pre-registered commitment. So we would do pilot studies and we'd go, okay, I think we've got something here. But once you locked it in, that then committed the entire project to first run the confirmation study and then run a replication by all 4 labs. And so even if the confirmation study didn't work, we were still all locked in for doing this massive series of replications. And the rules of the game, we have a whole manual that we prepared in preparation for this, said that we only shared a well-written method section between labs. So we didn't give them the scripts, we didn't give them the actual materials. The only materials that we shared were visual materials. So if there were, say, a video or a slide or something like that, that was shared. But all other things were only included in what we considered to be a well-written methods section. And then every study involved a single between subject condition. So we were trying to just get a very simple, elegant design. So every study just had to have 2 conditions or one variable with 2 levels. And it involved 1,500 participants, each run in 2 blocks of 750. So we would run 1 block of 750 and then a second block, and people were randomly assigned to the first block or the second block, which gave us yet another opportunity to potentially see a decline effect. Okay, so what were some of the innovations of this study? First, we exclusively conducted replication of newly devised experiments. Most all of the other there have been a few other studies that have tried to set out to discover new things and then look at replication, but most replication studies have involved looking at pre-existing studies and attempting to replicate those. And when people rely on pre-existing studies, there are some challenges with that. First off, one doesn't know all the details about those pre-existing studies, no way to assess how many unpublished studies were also associated with those or whether there were analyses that were hidden from view. It's unclear how to sample which studies to choose from when you're choosing pre-existing studies. There may be hidden agendas in which particular studies people set out to replicate, and the replicators themselves who decide to choose to replicate a particular study, they may have some agenda of their own, like, I think this study looks fishy to me, I want to try to replicate this one. So by using newly discovered studies within this local group, we were really sort of getting a clean sample of what it's like to replicate studies in psychology. This provides a cleaner way to assess robustness. And then also with respect to decline effects, if decline effects exist, we can see them from the onset of the discovery of the new result. A second innovation was that every lab committed to replicating regardless of outcome of confirmation study. This is kind of a bizarre thing. So we all committed to, even if that confirmation study was completely flat, we would still attempt to replicate it 4 times, which allows for the possibility of incline effects. So it's possible that even though we didn't get an effect at first, perhaps we will discover it later on. Another innovation, this is a little bit less innovative, but still very critical aspect of thing, is we carefully logged all aspects of the research protocol analyses. And by including all aspects of it, we were able to maximize the likelihood of a good replication, and also providing us the opportunity, if we failed to find replication, figuring out what perhaps discrepancies between the lab that, say, got the effect and the lab that didn't, that was contributing to these differences. Another innovation was just the power of these studies. 1,500 participants is very powerful relative to your average psychology experiment with two conditions. And so this allowed us to really sort of maximize the likelihood of finding effects. And it also allowed us to carefully examine the possibility of decline effects if they were there. We engaged in multiple replication attempts. So each study involved a confirmation study that was then replicated by all the 4 participating laboratories. And this provides a powerful test of the robustness of each effect, an opportunity to observe decline effects between labs, and an opportunity to examine differences between the originating lab and the replicating lab. So one possibility is that you'd consistently find that the originating lab would have a larger effect than the replicating labs. We also looked at replications within laboratories. We had, as I mentioned before, the 750-750 split, which really provides sort of the tightest test of the decline effect because we ran 750 participants and then immediately after ran another set of 750 participants. There's no reason why we should get differences between these 2 rounds. And then lastly, we investigated the effect of observation. For half of the studies that we ran, we kept the outcome blind, including the confirmation, all the outcomes blind until the final unveiling until the confirmation and all 4 replications were run. And in the other half, we unblinded after each study was done and announced the results to the rest of the team. Okay. So we are now nearly complete with this massive project, which has taken how many? 6 years, yes. So this is not an easy project to do. We are halfway through wave 4, and all the wave 4 studies have been logged in. So we've discovered we've got our findings, and we project that the completed results be done in October. So these are just preliminary interim results, but they're as follows. So we have 5 main analyses that we looked at. First off is the reproducibility rate. How successful were we in replicating these 16 new discoveries? The second is the comparison of the confirmation versus the self-replication. And this is important because it allows us to see when the same lab does a study twice, do you see any decline effect? We looked at the analysis of the slope of change over time. So do we see sort of a gradual decline in the way that I showed in, say, that schizophrenia study? And then we looked at the comparison of the 750-750 split. Is there any difference between the first 750 and the second 750? And then last, we looked at the effects of observation. Okay. So what we found is that 13 of the 16 confirmation studies that we've analyzed so far, we have analyzed 13 of the 16 confirmation studies. So that's where we are in the project. And of those 13 confirmation studies, 11 were successfully replicated. 11 of the 13 confirmation studies were successful. So when we ran the confirmation study, it worked 11 out of 13 times. For those successful confirmation studies, 46 replication attempts, we did 46 replication attempts, 41 were successful. So in other words, we had an 89% reproducibility rate. And we think that this is a quite exciting result. What it suggests is that when you do psychology studies very carefully and log everything, we're approximating a 90% reproducibility rate. So that is quite encouraging and provides a contrast to the kind of reproducibility rate we've seen in other replication efforts. It's also interesting to look at the unsuccessful confirmation studies. We had 2 unsuccessful ones, and we have done 7 replications of those unsuccessful ones, and 2 of the replications were equally unsuccessful. But interestingly, 5 were successful. So that is, we got, even though the confirmation study didn't work, we nevertheless got significant results with the replication. And this, I think, is really an interesting point. What it suggests is that even when you run a study with 1,500 participants, don't be cautious in accepting the null hypothesis, because we found in many of these cases you can still get the results. So I think this is also a really interesting, a very novel result. People usually don't go about trying to replicate a study that failed to find an effect with 1,500 participants. We did, and we found something quite interesting. Okay, now with respect to the decline effect, largely we did not see any evidence of a decline effect. The analysis of slope change across replications, so this is between the confirmation study, the first replication, second replication, third replication, fourth replication, and incidentally we counterbalanced across labs who was first, second, third, and fourth in a very elaborate and sophisticated counterbalancing process. No evidence of decline effect across labs. When we compared the confirmation in a laboratory to the self-replication from the same laboratory, no difference. Interestingly, intriguingly, don't want to make a whole lot out of it, but when we compared the first 750 to the second 750, we actually did see a non-significant smaller effect in the second 750 than the first 750. The p-value there is 0.17. So we need to keep running the rest of the analyses to see if that effect is maintained, in which case it might become significant. More likely it will decline. Yeah, this is the thing. We are likely to see a decline in the decline effect. Good riddance. And then lastly, the blinding, there was no effect of blinding. Okay, so what are some of the tentative conclusions to be refined in light of further findings? The first one, and I think the most important one, is that psychological science can be highly robust when conducted following a gold standard of practices. So we found a nearly 90% replication rate, which we think is really quite exciting and speaks to sort of the solidity of the scientific method as applied to psychology. The second is that when we held the sort of standard sources of a decline effect, when we ruled out the standard sources of decline effect, we saw relatively or virtually no evidence of a decline effect, although there still is that little hint of the possibility with the 750-750 split. Don't hold your breath on that, but we'll get back to you on that. Third, we found no evidence of observer effects, so the blinding had no effect. And nevertheless, though, it's important to emphasize that these are preliminary and additional results may emerge. So what are some of the additional directions that we are going with respect to this data set and potentially future? One question is, and this would really be a question for future research, is what element of our process assured such high replication rates? There are a number of things that distinguished this set of studies. They were very highly powered, so that may be a very important thing. We engaged in exhaustive pre-registration. That may be important. We had a very simple design, just to 2 levels of a single condition. That may be important. We relied on a representative population, and then each of the other labs also used representative population. And then we were doing this with newly discovered findings rather than selecting findings from the literature that may be pre-selected or may be being selected for reasons that somehow people are considering them a suspect. So a number of possible reasons that future research is required to enable us to figure out why we got such a high replication rate. Another question is, can we find any evidence in this data set for decline effects? Again, the 750-70-50 split is still a possibility. But another place where we're more optimistic that we may find evidence of decline effects is in, rather than comparing the confirmation study to the subsequent replication studies, to compare the pilot study, the effect size of the pilot study, to the effect size of the confirmation study. And here we have the opportunity for the regression to the mean mechanism, because when each lab decided, oh, I think I've got a powerful effect here, they were doing on smaller n, and there they may have been artificially inflated, and so it's quite plausible that when we compare the magnitude of the pilot study effects to the magnitude of the confirmation study effects, that we will find a decline effect there, and that would then support this regression to the mean possibility. What else can we learn from prospective metascience studies? So this is really sort of a fascinating sort of laboratory for looking at the process of scientific discovery. So we can compare the different labs in terms of the strategies that they used for finding new discoveries. Some labs were more efficient in finding findings than others, so we can sort of compare the different labs and the way in which they discovered things, the methodologies that they used. We can also look at scientists' ability to predict the outcome of studies. So can people predict, as these are studies that no one has done before, can people predict which studies work and which studies don't work? And so I encourage you, you may have received a survey of, or you should have received a survey regarding studies, and in those are studies that actually worked and studies that didn't work. I'm not going to tell you which are which. So the interesting question is, can you predict to what degree can you predict the studies that worked versus the ones that didn't? And then a final question is, how does sample size influence the conclusions that we draw? So we can take a look to see if we had run each one of these studies, say take a look at the confirmation and just look at the first 200 participants, would we have concluded that there was an effect there? As I mentioned, we found even in the case of 1,500 participants, sometimes we didn't get an effect, where it turns out there actually seems likely that there was one given the outcome of the replication study. So this data set provides us a very sort of powerful opportunity to look at not just doing estimates with power analyses, but actually looking at what the relationship is between the size of a sample and the conclusions that scientists draw. So we feel that this is a sort of a new way of looking at replication, a prospective way where we're discovering new things, and that's allowed us to make some important conclusions regarding the power of the scientific method in the context of psychology, and also to isolate and better understand possible sources of the decline effect. Thank you for your attention, and let me just once again acknowledge the large cast of characters that contributed to this. I'd like to also do a shout out to Bruce Fetzer, who was critically involved in many of these different things, although I didn't list him as an author, and of course the Fetzer Franklin Fund, which very generously supported this research. Thank you very much. Go ahead.
Norbert Schwartz, psychology at the University of Southern California. Jonathan, can you tell us a bit more about the type of tasks? I mean, you didn't say anything really about the substance. I'm inferring from the fact that it has two conditions, that it was representative samples with survey companies, which basically means online panels, that this was essentially something like two versions of a question presented on a screen. So it would rule out a lot of differences in delivery and implementations. There's no human interaction whatsoever. You're not aware you're in an experiment because you think you're answering survey questions. The population doesn't have much variance because it's not one student sample against another. Representative sample should more or less match, kind of, etc. But I would like to hear a little bit more about the substance of what was the task that people did that allowed for that.
Yeah, I'm being reticent about going into the details of the individual studies because we're using this population to evaluate the content of them. But they involved oftentimes studies that involved different wordings of materials. There were some that involved sort of moral types of dilemmas. There were some that introduced the kinds of manipulations that you can introduce in a survey context. We did do a number of things to try to increase the ecological validity. So each lab, I failed to mention this, but there was a videotape, a video introduction to the experiment done independently by each different lab that introduced the participants to it to sort of give them a little bit of an experience of interacting with an individual. As I mentioned, each lab used a different survey company, so even though they were all representative samples, there are idiosyncrasies to the survey companies which potentially could contribute to differences and so on. And with respect to the details of the individual studies, you'll just have to wait on that. Sorry.
Hi, Jonathan. It's John Krosnick. Let me just correct a tiny thing that you said, just in light of Norbert's comment. So these were not representative samples of American adults. These were opt-in samples from online panel providers that had demographics looking like the country, but there was no random sampling done, which is different from the Jaeger paper that you mentioned earlier that's in press now. Second thing is that everybody can see, I would encourage you to do it now, but if you follow that link to the survey, you can see a description of all the studies that we did, some of which worked, some of which didn't. So it's all in there. But basically, social psychology has gone running so much toward the MTurk way of online data collection that the mode of data collection didn't really limit the nature of the studies at all compared to what's typically being done. The only thing we didn't have was people coming into labs and interacting with individuals. But we did do a little bit of replication in a lab and got the same results in a lab with humans as we got online.
Thank you, John.
You put the list of what elements of our process assured, your question, what elements of our process assured such high replication rates? Because I think I have an additional suggestion. Yeah, two back.
Is this
Yeah, two slides.
what elements of our process are sort of
Yeah. If you can't
hello,
see that.
somebody. Is there a tech person who can make my slides available?
There you go. Yes.
There you go.
That this experiment was done in an extraordinarily. This is a question, I guess, to add. Experiment was done in.
Sorry, say again who you are.
Yeah, I'm Neil Thomason from the University of Melbourne. That the experiment was done in an extraordinarily odd situation. That each experimenter knew that three extremely respected colleagues were going to look very carefully over the videos and what they did. And one reason might be that they cleaned up their act considerably. And that those four, that's all probably good things, but cleaning up act when watched by your colleagues and knowing your long-term status in the profession might be affected if you really screwed up. That should be on that list. I don't know how you're going to test that.
Yeah. That's a good observation. I think we all sort of felt under the microscope, both with respect to trying to find findings. It's very challenging to find findings when you're under the pressure to find something. But then also we knew that everything we did was going to be carefully scrutinized, and we didn't want to be like the UCSB effect, where we never got effects to replicate. Or even worse, the UCSB effect where no one could replicate our effects. Either one would be feel very good.
Yeah. Well,
yes.
My question goes the same direction. I mean, probably like thinking of the reproducibility
Sorry,
of
who are you?
Olavo Amaral, Federal University of Rio. So I guess the reproducibility rate really hinges on what do you consider a new finding here. And I'll guess like people doing big replication studies have very much more conservative definitions of what a new finding is, and if you're being watched by somebody else, maybe even more. And you could actually argue that you're missing something. I mean, if you get too stringent on that, you might be losing out on possible hits that you don't want to go through all this replication process because I'm not that sure. So like, did you have explicit criteria for calling a hit? Like, what's the criteria each lab used to say
That's a great
this is a new
question.
finding?
So what I can tell you is that at least one of our findings is in press in psychological science, from the UCSB. So the finding was and a number of other findings are in various levels of publication. So so these findings were not just, or we believe that these findings were not just really banal variations on pre-existing things, but that's also part of what the survey is getting at, is to look at people's evaluation of the novelty and surprisingness of the results. So it's a question. It's a well-considered question, one that we anticipated, but it is our expectation that when people review the particular discoveries that we made, that they will stand up as being novel discoveries.
Yeah, but each lab was fully free to define what they consider this is a finding that's worth replicating. You didn't have like any preset criteria. We'll move on if we have like a p-value.
Well, so what happened? Yes, to be clear, the teams met twice a year and discussed studies that we were considering as possible candidates for confirmation studies, and we would discuss the scientific merit of that study, if it were to work, as being a meaningful contribution. Thank you.
Neil Malhotra, Stanford, political science. So I've taken your survey, so I'm going to ask the question really carefully, not to bias it. So I'm doing my best. So I guess the question, in order to answer your first question, is to make sure that these 16 studies are kind of a representative sample of how social psychology is done, or how, what it is done in the field.
And cognitive. They weren't all necessarily social.
Or whatever, right? But there seems to be like some unique characteristics. So there is nothing like, there's no physical intervention, there's no behavioral outcome. And a lot of the stuff that's we think of kind of crazy in social psychology tends to have those features, which is correlated with small n, like holding the hot cup of coffee and being like warm, you know what I'm talking about? Whereas I think when you're just answering questions on a computer screen, so I guess, long story short, if this is not a representative sample of kind of the body of research that could be done, how can you kind of extend the conclusions that it would apply to other kinds of research? Whereas kind of like the first order issue might be like, don't do crazy studies with like very low theoretical bases, as opposed to these kind of things.
I think for sure there are limitations to the kind of studies that you can do on using survey populations, although, as John Krosnick pointed out, increasingly that is the population, those are the kinds of studies that psychologists are doing. So it is, I think, a reasonably representative sample of the kinds of studies that are increasingly being done in psychology. Yes?
Yeah, I'm Zoltán Kekec from Hungarian Academy of Sciences. And so I've, you said that in the 750-750 split, there would be no reason to find like a difference. But so depending on your sampling strategy used, this could be, even if you find an effect, it could be like a time of the day effect or a day of the week effect, depending on how you provided the survey to the two samples. So I wouldn't get extremely excited even if you find a P0.05. Yeah. Okay.
I think that's. I think if we were to get a difference, then it would suggest that there's more work needs to be done
yeah,
to try
exactly.
to
Yeah.
understand what's going on there.
I agree.
It is also possible, one other concern that it could be, that would be so rather banal explanation is if there were more repeats in the second 750 than in the first 750, then people who'd done the survey twice might not show the effect. So there are certainly, we wouldn't have to go directly to the effective observation kind of account. But it would be interesting to see that if that did show up.
Yeah, and I just wanted to point out that I took the survey before the talk, and I would fill it out differently after the talk. I just want to point this out for you.
I wouldn't.
Okay, yes.
I'll say, first off, I think, if a fraction of the things on the survey were studies that you did, I mean, it's pretty. I think one of the things that's really refreshing about the study is that many people have kind of bellyached about this efforts to reproducibility is just dumbing down any interesting study possibilities in psychological science or other science. And I think at least from my perspective, this kind of suggests. And I think it's a nice move to kind of push towards, it's not against discovery. In fact, it's just about replication. It's not about, kind of dumbing down or making less interesting or more incremental the class of findings. My question is, so for physical constants, people have looked at the measurement of the speed of light, the measurement of, Planck's constant, of the fine structure, constant. I mean, all these things over time, and what they tend to move basically towards a current estimate, smoothly often towards a current estimate. And so one question, and most of the reason that's attributed to that is basically differences in methodology over time. That you can imagine evolving set of methods, right, and an evolving set of possible effects that find each other. Right, and the likelihood that they find each other then conditions a decreasing likelihood that subsequent methods are going to fit, which is to say, to accentuate that finding or discover that finding in the same way. So to what degree, you talked about sharing between the labs, that you just wrote method section, except in some cases, you shared visuals, you shared videos. So I could, reasonably expect that there was more sharing, right, just as a function, for example, of the media that were conditioned on the priming effects and some had less. And I'm curious the degree to which those end up modulating the likelihood of replicability across these studies. Because I think that's the primary effect that people have looked at over long historical time in the evolution of findings.
Well, since most replicated, there isn't going to be a whole lot of variance to look for that kind of modulation. But we certainly can, we haven't looked at that particular element yet, and we certainly can. As you were speaking, I also had a thought with respect to Zoltan's observation, which is actually, it's an empirical test. We can look to see if there are any systematic differences in people's answers to the questionnaires before and after the survey. Sorry for a little mind wandering there, but thank you. Okay.
Hi, Maya Salal from the Science and Technology Policy Institute and incoming at Quest Center in Berlin, Meta Research. I had a question about the replications, the successful replications of the results that didn't work in the confirmatory analyses. So you put out the 89% replication rate based on the norm that you're replicating previous experiments. So you consider, so normally you're checking whether an existing result.
No, just to be.
Or does that 89% also include the 7 that?
No, so the 89% corresponds to the replication rate for the successful confirmation studies.
Right. And I'm wondering, did you consider what the successful replications of the non-successful confirmatory might mean in terms of having that integrated in some way in some sort of replication rate? Because that's a number that, or a value you don't normally have in replication studies because you're not doing new research. So how did you consider that as a group, if you have? And the other part about those null results, the replication of the non-confirmed results, what would that mean for changing psychology research? Because are we supposed to go on and do replications when we have no confirmation of a pilot in the future?
So what I think let me answer the first part, or sorry, the second part first, because that's the part which I have greater clarity on. I think that oftentimes people run a study and they don't get a result and they go, oh, there's nothing there, and they move on. And they give up. And what this suggests is that can lead you to overlooking what seem to be real effects. And so you should be cautious in taking a single failure to get a confirmation as evidence that the study didn't work. It may be that it was simply underpowered, and that had you, even with 1,500 participants, what this suggests, and that there's a small effect there that has been, that's being missed. So I think that it means be very cautious in accepting the null hypothesis. With respect to how to collapse, how to fold in the positive results of the negative associated with the negative confirmation studies, I think we created a design which introduces a new sort of dilemma that people don't normally face. And I think that the way that we handled it by treating them separately is the most straightforward way. And certainly researchers, once this is published, can recombine the data in different ways if they want to, for example, say what was the total proportion of confirmation studies that were that were associated with positive results in the replication phase, regardless of what happened in the confirmation phase. Thank you for your question. Thank you all for your attention.